passed away. And he who sits on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. Brothers and sisters, when you and I become this city, then the tabernacle of God will be among men. When you and I become the city, he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. When you and I become the city, he will wipe away every tear from our eyes. When you and I become the city, there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying and pain. When you and I become the city, the former things will pass away, and all things will be made new. When we become the city, the New Jerusalem has no tears, no sorrow, no death, no pain, no temple, no sacrifices, no sun, no moon, no darkness, no sin, no abomination, and no memory of the things which once were. This happens when we become the New Jerusalem. When we become the city. For we are the light of the world. A city set on a hill. It cannot be hidden. Jesus said, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand. And it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works. Your what? Your good works. Not our shows, not our buildings, but our works. And glorify your Father who is in heaven. And so this is the mission. I told you earlier in the week that the work of the church is not the church. The work of the church is the mission. And the church is the city, the bride adorned when she is on the mission. And I want to give you an example of what that could look like. Some years ago, I was in Rwanda, and I was teaching a group of about 80 pastors. And they came from several East African countries. And I told them, I said, you want me to preach in your church? And I said, I'll tell you what I see. I drive past the hospital, and I see that the hospital doesn't have sufficient funding or financing to really care for the patients, especially in those days that sometimes they couldn't feed the patients. The families of the patients had to bring them their own food. Sometimes they didn't have sufficient medication. I remember my wife was in an African hospital, and she was in the maternity ward, and they didn't even have toilet seats in that maternity ward. And I said to those pastors, I drive past the school, and I see that sometimes the windows are broken and the doors are damaged, and I see that many of the children do not have school fees, and they cannot go to class. They may not have enough money for books and papers. And I said, I drive into your neighborhood, and I see the widow. She's alone. She's afraid. There's no one really there to care for her. And as I drive onto the street where your church is located, I see trash and garbage. and filth all along the street. And I come to your church, and I notice that it sits behind a fence and a wall. And I also notice that on your side of the fence, it's clean. But on the other side, it's not. It's filled with trash and garbage. I notice that your windows aren't broken. I notice that you have proper toilet facilities for your members. I see that you have a vision for your church, but not for your city. And I said to those pastors today, God is giving you a promotion. You are no longer the pastor of a church. You are the shepherd of a city. When I finished, the young man picture who's on the right came to me. He was broken. He was sobbing. And he said to me, I have to do this. I have to do what you've taught us. But I don't know how to do it. I don't know where to start. His name is Eugene. I said, Eugene, I can't tell you how to do this. Only the Holy Spirit can, and He will. But I can tell you this. Go back to your city. Go back to the darkest place in your city where there are no churches. Go to the place in your city that is the most unclean. And get on your face before God. And beg Him to show you the first steps. Ask Him to bring you your first disciple. So Eugene did that. He went back to his city and he rented this room. And this room is a room in a house of prostitution, a brothel. He rented it. And he went in and he began to fast and pray. And he said, God, I'm not leaving here until you bring me my first disciple. And so there was a knock on the door, and it was a young man. And the young man said, what are you doing here? Aren't you a pastor? And he said, yes, I am. He led that young man to Christ and cast vision for him about what he was doing there. And he sent that young man to another place in the city similar to the one that he was in. And that young man made 50 disciples the first year. And so Eugene felt that he was not released from this room. He continued to fast and pray. There was another knock at the door. It was a young girl. It was one of the prostitutes. And so he led her to Christ. And he and his wife discipled her. And she led 15 other prostitutes to Christ in a short time. They had never been tested for HIV/AIDS, which was rampant. Eugene took them to the local government AIDS hospital. 11 of them tested positive. In the meantime, Eugene still didn't feel a release. He felt there was someone else. Continued to fast and pray. Now there was a third knock at the door, a very angry knock. He opened the door, and here is the owner of the brothel. And he said, what are you doing here? Since you have come here, I have lost all my business. I have no more customers. What are you doing? And Eugene said, I'm glad you asked me that. And he told that man what he was doing. And he led that man to Christ. And the owner of that brothel gave to Eugene the buildings and property associated with the brothel. These are the rooms where the business would take place, and this was the bar, the saloon, and it became their church building, their meeting place. This is the bar where they sold the liquor. It became his pulpit. See, that's what happens when we become the city. When we become the city, bars become pulpits. And so these are some of the first disciples of Eugene. The young girl standing with the baby in the middle was the first prostitute that came to Christ. The young man scooting down with his hands up was the first disciple that he sent out to a place in the city. And so Eugene continued to work. The girls on the left in blue are young girls. Many of them were AIDS orphans. Eugene and his wife began to disciple them, to take them in, to show them skills, how to make crafts and sew, so they had some kind of marketable way to make a living. The women who are sitting on the right, they are all former prostitutes. Eugene virtually shut down prostitution in his city. You see one woman there in the front row leaning forward with her chin in her hands. She was introduced to me as being the most famous prostitute in Rwanda. I do not know how you get that title, nor do I care to know. But I can tell you that the most famous prostitute in Rwanda begged me for Bibles. And so Eugene felt like, I've got to do more. It's not enough. And so he remembered the AIDS hospital that he took the prostitutes to. How filthy it was. He saw that the windows were broken, that the grounds were filthy and littered, and many of the patients did not have beds, and there wasn't enough help to really care for them. And so Eugene took his disciples and put them in that hospital. And they worked every day of the week in that hospital, not only volunteering, but they paid for the materials that they needed. They repaired windows, they planted flowers, they scrubbed toilets and bathing areas. They built beds. They washed the clothes of the patients. They bathed the patients. And many times they held the patients as they died. I walked through that hospital in tears because I had been in many hospitals. And none of them was like this one. The head of the nurses came to Christ. The head of the hospital came to Christ. The government of Rwanda sent an inspector to the hospital. Even he came to Christ. He said to Eugene, you've been doing this at your own expense. I'm going to give you a government contract, and I'm going to ask you to go into these 3 other hospitals.